Hello, welcome to the AHURI webinar. I am Dr. Tom Alves. I'm the Head of Development at the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute, AHURI, and I'm joining you today from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I'd like to begin by paying my respects to elders past and present, and also to welcome any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who may be joining us today as well. For those of you who don't know us, AHURI is an independent national organisation. We deliver high quality research on housing, homelessness and cities. We're funded by the federal, state and territory governments, and our research is delivered by our university research partners from across the country. Today, we'll be discussing our latest published research, which has the title, Inquiry into Housing Policy and Disaster, Better Coordinating Actors, Responses and Data. The final inquiry report published today and the 4 other reports that sit alongside this final report can all be found on the AHURI website, and I encourage you to have a look at them later on. After the webinar today, this webinar, which is being recorded, will also be available on the AHURI website over the next couple of days. And I encourage you to share that with others or have a look at it again yourselves. And look, a big welcome to those of you who are joining us live. It's a pleasure to have you with us. And just a quick bit of housekeeping on how to participate in the webinar today. On the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see a chat function. This is live and active, and you're very welcome to communicate with one another during the course of the webinar using that function. You may want to break the ice now by indicating what country you're joining the webinar from. And look, please put in there any thoughts and comments you might have as well. And there's also the opportunity to use that to ask some questions, but at the end of the webinar, I will be running a bit of a Q&A session. A number of you presented questions ahead of the webinar, and I'll be working from those, but there's an opportunity for me to pick up on other topics or areas of interest that arise during our conversation. All right, Professor David Sanderson, welcome. David's from the University of New South Wales, and he led the research for this inquiry report. David's expertise is in urban disaster resilience and humanitarian aid. He has over 30 years experience working in the development and in response to emergencies across the world. His particular focus has been on emergency housing support for disadvantaged communities who are displaced by a range of things, including natural disasters, geopolitical conflicts, socioeconomic exclusion, and environmental factors. And I'd also like to welcome to the webinar today, Melinda Dewsnap. Melinda is the Acting Chief Resilience Officer for Resilient Sydney. Resilient Sydney is a collaboration of the 33 Greater Sydney councils who are aligned with the Global Resilient Cities Network. Later on in the webinar, I'll be asking Melinda to offer her reflections on how she sees the findings of David's research having an impact in the Australian policy and practice contexts. But over to you first, David. Look, David, would you mind telling us what was the context for your research, and in particular, the research that informed this final inquiry report?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. And firstly, thanks very much, AHURI, for providing a platform to explore this intractably difficult issue and to come out with what we hope are valuable findings for practice. So thank you to you, and thank you to AHURI, and thank you everybody for joining today. The first thing to say is it's incredibly complicated, and that's not an excuse to not say anything, but just to recognize that there are so many options, so many intangibles. At one of our research meetings, somebody said this is a wicked problem, and there are many wicked problems, and certainly not want to disagree on that. But very briefly, it's to do with disasters and housing, and we know that disasters are getting worse and more intense, climate-fueled and other types too, and housing, we were in a crisis pre-recent disasters to do with housing affordability. So the Venn diagram there is about those two things. And so we looked, thanks to the guidance of AHURI, at coordination in 3 levels. We took it, one related to actors, as you say, and we took that as planning, policy, and disaster policy. And of course, we live in a society with 3 levels straight off, and that adds for dimensions of complexity we might talk about. And that research was led by colleagues at RMIT in Melbourne. The second one related to responses, and that was across what they call PPRR. That one, prevention, preparedness, recovery, and response. So they don't use it internationally, but you know what I mean. The cycle of disaster, the before and the after. Sorry about that.
Right.
And UNSW led on that, and we were really looking at the complexity of post-disaster housing provision and also what happens long-term, because we all know that's also complex. And then thirdly, led by Francesca Perugia at Curtin University, looking at data, at the complexities of data and how we get better at that, knowing we're in a data-driven world. So we had 3 reports on those, and this is the overall inquiry we're going to, I think, discuss today.
Yeah, no, thanks, David. That's really great. We're looking forward to hearing more about the inquiry in particular, but no doubt you'll be telling us a bit about some of the other reports and some of their key findings along the way as well. Look, to kick us off, David, I wonder if you could maybe give us a short example of how disaster has impacted housing in a community, and maybe talk a little bit about how that community coped with that disaster, what they did, and how they demonstrated the kind of resilience, perhaps, that you are studying in this work.
Thanks, Tom. And tragically, there are so many examples, and we're in a phase now where people talk about cascading disasters, one after the other, and those things. So I want to be very mindful. I'm not going to show any triggering photos, by the way. That's not interesting to anybody in that sense of drama. We all know that. The bushfires, of course, were terrible. 2019, 2020, bushfires are always terrible. These are more recent terrible ones. And to recognize also we've had floods and windstorms too since then. But just picking up this one story in the Snowy Valleys, just a brief story to kick us off, as you say. Around Batlow, Tumbarumba, Adelong, small rural towns, intensely beautiful, Apple State. You know, the fires came and the fires raged, and the RFS did, as they do, a beyond amazing job at saving as much as they could. Batlow was called to be indefendable, and so people fled in fear of their lives, of course, you know, to some degree. Some people there, Joe Morell from Anglicare, picked up people on the side of the road who are apple pickers who spoke no English, and so that speed to get things out. And what I'm driving at here is local capacity, by the way. People fled, 17 houses were destroyed, and people came back. And people fled, some people never came back, other things. But what I want to pick up, though, is that people-centered approach in recovery and actions. That's Kate Johansson, Australian Red Cross, working. This is actually Tumberfest. And a number of them and us and others were involved in an initiative called the Resilient Towns Initiative, which was funded by New South Wales government, which we're grateful for. And we simply said, how can we make our communities safer? And that was with Anglicare, with the City Council, Snowy Valleys Council, which I think we're going to come back to. The whole title of this is about localization, the 4th R. And so this is about people talking and connecting. This is it's called a Big Map initiative that Disaster Relief Australia literally unrolled, because it's a whopping big map in several areas which the Reconstruction Authority picked up on, visualizing in a simple way the complexity. And this is about ownership. And you mentioned resilience. All the evidence is resilience is best when it's locally owned. Resilient Batlow did an amazing job. Other initiatives relating to people being in the driving seat and agencies supporting rather than providing. And I think I'll stop there. I just fear of rambling, but really the getting together to connect and to talk and to listen. And this is Tumberfest, hence the ducks. So let me pass over to you, Tom.
Yeah, no, thanks, David. Look, it's always good to get a bit of a, see some real life pictures and get a bit of a sense of communities engaging with disaster and recovery from it. I want to focus in now on the actual inquiry report that we're publishing today and that you led the delivery of. First of all, can you just run through what the research found? What were your key findings, David?
Yes. I can, and thank you. And I want to acknowledge my colleagues who are really leading in those particular areas I mentioned. So when we talk about planning, that was Jago Dodson and Annette Kroner at RMIT, of course with others. They were the lead on that. And they're real gurus in planning. And they looked at planning policy, disaster policy, at federal, state, and local levels. And of course, it's complicated. We found, again, who knew? Silos, of course, you can name anything and talk the silo, not because it's the systems, right? It's complicated, it's difficult. The report talks about the different ones. Of course, there's a measure of overlap, but not enough. And so having Venn diagrams instead of silos, I suppose, is our push. And the main finding for them was making disasters a planning priority, because of course there are endless competing priorities. One person said to us during the research, the floods hit a housing disaster, meaning the chronic shortage up in the northern rivers. So to recognize that, so land is precious at a premium, but making it a priority. Someone said to us, a very senior insurance person in one of our meetings, and he summed it up. He said, I don't understand why we still build in flood zones. And you think, my God, that's a statement, and then it was silence in the room. But there are a lot of good things happening. This is not a doomsayers thing. There's lots of good stuff. New South Wales Reconstruction Authority just a week ago actually launched the disaster, the DAPS they call it, disaster. My daughter's got flu and I'm a little bit under it, so that's my it's part of the state disaster mitigation plan. I know that.
Yeah.
They have a risk reduction toolkit. They're including building codes in that. The DAPS are all about how you go sideways and make vents, if you like. The second bit of research, and I'll probably speed up a bit, Tom, relates to the short-term need for being dry and warm and safe after a disaster and the long-term rebuilding. And we all know that pods are well-intended, but have a shelf life, are very expensive. What you do afterwards, it's complex. Shelter after disaster is complex around the world, and I could bang on for that for hours. Well-intended, difficult. So using local stuff as much as you can, pods as a last resort, and if you use them, have a plan what you do afterwards. So linking those things, using local resources, a lot of caravan parks we use, a lot of stuff, insurance, rebuilding, all those complexities. I'm really giving headlines as an invite to look in the report. And then the third bit that Francesca Perugia, who's a real guru in data, led on. And her headline was putting the trust back into data. And what she means by that, it's a little bit the silo thing also, but who owns data, who controls it? Of course, rightly so, there are rules and regulations around privacy, of course. But then if that gets in the way, who owns it? And one of the things she found, of course, and we'll come back to this a lot, overwhelmed, under-resourced local authorities, of course, hire out people to do stuff. And then who controls the data and who owns it? So there's a lot on this. But the quick summary across all three was the need to localize recovery, localize response, policies that support, not provide. That's not controversial, but it is controversial when you have too many people in the driving seat at senior levels and not enough at local levels. So our push is around local government being more in the driving seat. They're there before, after. You might say, and this is my final statement, you might say, well, they don't have the capacity. Well, that's because it's been years of neglect when it comes to not thinking about disasters. So our big call is the long-term shift around shifting governance to be bottom-up, where all the evidence lies about what works best in recovery.
Okay. And that was one of your key findings, I think, in the inquiry, is that the fact that local government has a central and important role, but that role is hampered. Can you just unpack that a little bit more? Like how is that role being constrained? What did you find through the research that indicated that hampering of that local role?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. And it goes all the way through, and it was in the planning and also Francesca's work, and especially ours. I mean, it's not a surprise to anybody. I've never been anybody who's disagreed that recovery is community-centered. It's at the center of the SDMP. It's literally the three of the five from New South Wales state. And I'm sorry, a bit New South Wales focused, but elsewhere across Australia at federal level, of course, everybody agrees. The reality, however, is funding models prevent that funding devolving to local. And in saying LGAs, it's also a proxy for civil society organizations, NGOs. And we all know that after a disaster, funding comes in for organizations to work, and rightly so. But then, possibly not wrongly, but we can discuss this, that funding diminishes and goes. And it's always that. It's a global phenomenon. And you think, well, yeah, we should do that. We provide funding after a disaster, that it should go. So there is an argument for that. But also it goes and the capacity is gone. So where I live in Wollondilly, there's one person who was working on a 2-year contract, 3 days a week on resilience, working out of the back of a van, when we have 100 plus clever people at state level and federal level doing great jobs. This is not about people, but the systems are top down. And you're not incentivized to engage. You're certainly not incentivized to fund or to trust. We have a lack of trust in our systems. Of course, we need accountability, but a complete lack of trust in our systems based on a, frankly, command and control model that is not suited for community-centered recovery. So what we found was, if we're going to be serious about localizing, we do need to think, and that comes around decisions to do with land and policy and enacting and planning and data and all the things that the AHURI research looked at.
Yeah, great. If I can just pick up again on data quickly, if that's okay as well. I know that was the report that Francesca led, but in terms of how that came up into your final inquiry report as well, one of your key findings there is that data is essential to reducing disaster risk. What do you mean by that? Can you actually just sort of draw that link between having what is it about data that we're lacking, or that that is inadequate, and how does it directly relate to that risk mitigation? Can you actually draw that connection for us?
Yes, certainly. And I want to recognize again Francesca's work on this, and it's quite brilliant and astonishingly interesting. So please look at that. And I will do my best not to make such a terrible misrepresentation of her work. But the trust back into data was talking about the privacy I was talking about. She makes the point that a lot of data at a household level comes from how much your insurance premium is. And even whether you get insurance, of course, increasingly people can't afford it, not being offered it. And that's another topic to discuss, maybe even today. But the insurance industry has done quite a bit on this, recognizing the need to share data. They had a big thing in 2013 where they looked and they moved and have pressed forward on it. But of course, inevitably, progress is slow because there's a literal premium, but there's also a value, and it's a business model and those things. And we interviewed, and Francesca in particular, a number of clever insurance people who recognize the problems and want to make the differences. So I just want to mention that too. But if your information comes from insurance, that's something. But why not come from government? Why not be more useful? And Francesca makes the point that zoning and other laws that we have and other things are useful, but very limited in their sort of proximity. A pithy personal example, we're applying for DA and we're in a bushfire zone, and it's no. But when you get the person to actually do the assessment, it's completely fine because the granularity related to where you are and the rest. And that's a data issue. And when you can have satellite imagery getting down to 30 centimeters in a Google world, we should be doing better about the data. A final response also is, of course, a tragic classic, if you like, in recovery centers where the RA, I'm thinking, in fact, of a friend and colleague, Andrew Ray from Snowy Valleys, who went onto the RA, wants to share data to get lists of information of people to help, but is not allowed to because of data protection. And of course we need data protection. Of course we do. And at the same time, there's got to be a better way than this person here saying, I can't show you this because of protection. And Andrew is saying, but I need this to help those people over there. And everyone's frustrated, right? So it's never the people, it's the systems. But that simplification Francesca calls for about a system we must and can get better at, that is what she's been talking about.
Yeah, great. And I think, you're mentioning there, just to stay on data for a moment, you're mentioning there, obviously, there's the access to data. That's one of those issues. There's the quality of the data as well. But I guess another question is also then, what is the source of truth as well? Like, in a situation where there's a range of different data sources, how do local government particularly, how do they know what is the data to be using?
And that's a really great point. And there's been a lot of work on this, and I'm thinking back to international stuff. Even 15, 20 years ago, they used to call it communicating with disaster-affected communities and the risk of rumor being spread, especially the immediacy of a disaster. And as we know, people use Facebook, and there's lots of good stuff on Facebook, but it may not be a source of truth, or of course TikTok or X or whatever it might be. So the capacity of rumors and disasters has been around time immemorial, and is a knotty one, and is a greater risk, obviously, with what we see now with media. Lots of pluses, obviously, with media, and no cynicism here, but that managing, so if it's the BOM, the Bureau of Meteorology, providing stuff that's authentic, and I suppose the authenticity of the agencies and the clarity of the messaging. And it's also difficult, just a related point, by the way, that of course in many disaster situations, your mobile communication must go down. And mobile phones are now treated as an essential need, not wrongly. And so satellite data and information, and even accessing information every single time in the floods or the bushfires, has been an issue. And a lot of good people are getting good at this, by the way, and are working on it. It'd be wrong to say no. But of course, planning regulations about where you can put telecoms and things and the rest is something that will be sorted without doubt as technology advances like ways we've never seen before. But you put your finger on a big one there.
Yeah, okay. Well, thanks. And look, I'd like to bring Melinda in at this point to broaden our conversation. Melinda, we've heard David talk about, I guess, three of the key themes that have been looked at in the inquiry report. So just to reiterate, there's the question of planning, there's the question of, I guess, local governance and that localisation question. And then there's also a question about data, access to data, and having the right data available at the right time. Can you comment about the research findings around those, around some of those themes, and how you're seeing that play out? I know you're working in the metropolitan Sydney area with local governments there. Can you comment on some of those findings from your perspective?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. And firstly, I'd just like to congratulate AHURI on this fantastic research, because everything that Professor Sanderson has just outlined really reflects what we are living and what we know in local government. And Resilient Sydney, which is a collaboration of the 33 Greater Sydney councils, has been formed to address this very need for coordination and region-wide planning if we are to be a future-proofed resilient city. So the risks that we face and the huge structural changes and challenges of climate change coupled with urban growth and the housing crisis mean we really need a broader lens and view and greater coordination in this space. So I think the report findings are really terrific and really resonate from that perspective. In regards to the disaster, the prevention, preparedness, response, recovery cycle, local communities, of course, are at the heart of it. So we need to be, and we know through our latest Resilient Sydney strategy and the very in-depth risk assessment that was coupled with in-depth community consultation, is we need to be really people-focused with how we move forward. So communities are core to the decision making that affects them, and that community-centred recovery is really key in terms of fostering that self-reliance and self-determination, and really acknowledging the diversity of places and people across Greater Sydney. In regards to the data piece, that is foundational. So in addition to acknowledging the role and the coordination across all levels of government, we need to also really embed and look at how is the finance going to flow, how are we going to address the lack of capacity and the ability to employ long-term the specialty, the specialist skills we need in local government to address the risks we're facing and to make sure that we are building back better and future-proofing our communities in the context of climate change. And not only do we need that the finance and that capacity building, we also need the tools and frameworks to understand risk. We need to have a shared understanding across government and with all our core agencies around the scale and the nature of the problem, and data is central to that. So it is a complex space. Of course, we need to acknowledge data privacy and the like, but really need to be looking at how do we share in more nimble ways, and how are we really using data to respond, and we're responding to data as opposed to having policy reviews that are just responding to disaster events. So that is key. And I think all levels of government have a role to play there, but that local lens, the connection and the trust that local government has with community is really foundational for all aspects of this disaster management and the future addressing the housing crisis.
Yeah, thanks, Melinda. There, I think, some really wise observations from that. And can I just ask you, was there anything in the inquiry report that I guess surprised you, or that was it all sort of resonating with your experience, or was there something in there that maybe caught your attention as, I hadn't thought of that, or that's a bit different from what I was thinking? Anything catch you by surprise?
Look, I think that the framing around, resilience being the 4th R for local government, building on roads, rates and rubbish, I guess the point I'd like to make there is local government is already working well beyond the roads, rates, rubbish. So I think that's probably quite a reductive framing in terms of the role of local government currently. We are already having to work in, admittedly, without the resources required in this resilience space. And even if we look at how local government is addressing the disasters that we've had to date, I mean, local government's role in the COVID pandemic was well beyond anything that is mandated for a local government role. And that was because we are in our communities, we are working with community, we see the urgency of need, and we had to reorganise, restructure and be really nimble in how we addressed that. So I think, yes, the 4th R, resilience is key, but we need a 4th R for every level of government in Australia. That needs to also be in the state and in a federal context. And we know now we're spending 97% of our resourcing and finance is spent post-disaster, 3% upfront. So if we're serious about resilience, we need to be flipping that and looking at how do we invest upfront with really leveraging that local leadership and be, really switching the dial so we can prepare for what's coming. And I think with that investment, when we invest in things like good quality housing, and we're looking through a lens of equity and looking at the diverse needs of our communities, that doesn't only deliver benefits in regards to, disaster proofing or being, more forward thinking in how we prepare for what's coming. It also delivers social and economic and, dare I say, productivity benefits in Australia. So I think that was just one thing, just in terms of framing, that it was worth making a comment on, Tom.
Yeah, no, thanks, Melinda. And it sounds like there's a round table somewhere that maybe you should be at today. But appreciate those thoughts. Look, David, I want to now come back to the research. We've so far been talking about, I guess, some of the findings in terms of what you're observing in terms of issues and problems, and Melinda's already started now turning our attention towards, I guess, how we think about addressing these. And look, your research, I know, also looked at into the question of, like, what are the solutions, what are the ways forward, and it did, of course, use that framing of we're using that framing here of those. The 4th R, rates, rubbish, and roads being, I guess, the caricature of a local government set of responsibilities, and certainly the ones that most people rub up against on a day-to-day basis. But yes, I mean, obviously, local governments are doing a lot more than that already, and let's hope they are. But look, what does that 4th R mean in practice, and can you talk about that from a solutions perspective now?
Yeah, no, and just to pick up on that, Melinda, I mean, yeah, it's supposed to be a deliberately sticky statement. I, as Tom kindly mentioned, my background's elsewhere, and I don't care where you are in the world, it is always the case. Local council is overwhelmed and under-resourced, often not paid for months, if not years, literally, and I can cite examples. And so the advocacy around the localization of recovery, and our whole thing is about that. And someone just put, think of an R for economic development, and I'm sure there is one. I'm not going to say rates because we all pay those, but stuff like that. So it's really making the case for the localization is our point. But just on your point, Tom, I mean, a lot of the report is so what? This is not a whinge fest. It's around what's the policy, and just building off those central principles of localization. I've got 3 pages in front of me. I'm not going to read them all out. I'm just going to pick up some, and it is emphasizing prevention strategies. You mentioned, Melinda, the oft-cited, thing about expenditures after and before, and of course you need to spend afterwards by definition. But the more we spend up front, obviously, the less we spend after. And we're actually pretty good at preventing disasters as a species, but we're being faced by new threats. And the new threats, we all are aware of, are why we need to make the case for stronger localization, about the long-term game of having capacity locally, not top-down. In recovery and prevention and preparedness and resilience, we are not in a command and control approach. And if we're in a command and control approach, which we are in Australia, that's wrong. I'm going to say it. It's wrong. It needs to not be that. It's a paradigm of support, not provide. It's bottom up, not top down. It's development. It's akin to running healthcare as an emergency room rather than public health, and we have those systems, and we need to change that. And that's quite a big shift. That's quite controversial, but that's where the global evidence and the Australian evidence is. So in that spirit, it's our top recommendation is to emphasize prevention strategies. When it comes to housing, it's broadened solutions. Of course, it's less pods, although, it's understandable why some politicians go to that. It's not evil or anything, but they're expensive or short life. There's a saying internationally, there's no such thing as temporary shelter, because the political will's expended and the cost and all those things. So it's investing locally. It's using local markets, if you like, localizing recovery. Sorry, I'm just looking at these things. Buybacks we haven't talked about, controlled relocation, that's immensely controversial, but we may be in a situation where we have no choice, where relocation has clunked massively in Cabbage Tree Island, deeply controversial and very painful for those who said you can't go back to where you live in the Northern Rivers. That's a whole thing that's playing out. So how you do that is very politically and lots of different ways sort of intertwined, but it is taking this long-term stuff. Some of the stuff that the planning colleagues have talked about, my planning colleagues, it's integrating, it's making disasters a planning priority if you want to get prevention right. And it's a choice. There's a famous book came out some years ago called Disasters by Choice. In society, we make choices about what we risk, manage, and what we don't, and what we ignore. And disasters, as we all know, are anything but natural. There's no such thing as a natural disaster. Some people don't like that, but you know what? I'll stick to that gun.
David, can we also talk a bit about, we've talked about data, we've talked about local government roles. Can we flesh out a bit more the planning side of it? And I'm talking here about, planning as an activity of government. Often local government is the site where, planning is administered and implemented, but this is obviously an activity of mainly of state and territory governments in this country. What are those real solutions? How can planning better take natural disaster or disasters of choice, to use your reframing there, into account? Thanks for that, Tom. And again, I'll move on, but I just want to quickly restate it's a choice, and there are lots of competing priorities. You've got a whole swathe of land and lots of people who can't afford to live anywhere, and someone says you can't build on it because of a once in 40-year risk. You think, really? We can live with that. But as we know now, the frequency is increasing. So that's the issue. It's a different landscape. So we need to put it at the agenda. Of course, we would argue that. But others would argue, say, well, it's about housing affordability. So it is a decision. So some of the stuff Annette and Jago came out with, improve exchange of housing planning agencies. That's turning this, if you like, the silo to a Venn diagram. And there are different systems, different things. They talk about work cultures. Of course, who knew? Big bureaucracies have different cultures. Of course they do. That's like saying we breathe to live. So that's age old. But actually aligning that better, and there's a data argument from Francesca about an opportunity for alignment there, about speaking a similar language and having those things. It's political priorities, of course. It's always about governance and politics, and politicians having a long-term view about these things and deciding what matters and what's important and making those trade-offs. And heaven forbid it has to get worse before more of that happens, but let's see.
So stuff like that. But there are good moves. The SDMP, as I mentioned, the DAPs, there are other things coming in, which Jago and Francesca talk about, and also Annette around these things, because it's not a surprise anymore, and there's no excuses anymore, especially after the fires and then the terrible floods and the windstorms in Western Australia, for us to actually get better at this stuff.
Melinda, I'll bring you again on the planning question too, and look, feel free to speak beyond the Sydney context if you wish and if you can. But I'm also interested in, I guess, in that resilient Sydney space too. We have planning systems that were established maybe without these sorts of questions in mind initially, but they've been changed and adapted over time. How are those planning systems going and those planning practices as well? And what are you seeing that is happening? And maybe even if you're seeing some positive changes occurring, if you could maybe identify and reflect on those.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I think firstly, it's really pointed out well in the report, and I think it's something we're all reflecting on, that resilience is a relatively new discipline and it is a team sport. So how all the mechanisms and the layers of planning, the departmental and government silos and so on, this is a wicked problem, and there is a lot of complexity there, as David mentioned up front. So there are elements of the existing system that we can adapt and evolve. And then there are other things that we're also going to have to look at. Well, how do we do this in an entirely different way? And how are we going to start to bring in, and I mean, an example that leads back to the data would be for the NARCLIM data. Like, it took a long time to get the latest update to that. It's essential that we are using the latest and also forward projections in terms of the hazards we're facing and what's coming, because we can't afford as community or as any level of government not to be building climate resilient housing. So the cost of that is enormous in terms of people's health and safety, health and well-being, but also the amount of money that we are going to have to invest that's going to go beyond what any government can afford. So I think we really need to be looking at what do we evolve, but what new mechanisms do we need to address through the planning system and through all of our governance systems, because another barrier to resilience is taking into account the complex governance. And in Greater Sydney, of course, we've got 33 councils all working with state government. We've got over 500 councils across the country. So how we're going to work together is key. I do think that with the launch of the Disaster Adaptation Plan guidelines last week from the New South Wales Reconstruction Authority, it's really heartening to see how they are promoting the community resilience to the impact of disasters and aiming to reduce exposure and vulnerability of people and assets to natural hazards, to reduce disaster risk. So it will be really interesting for us to collectively learn from what's come out of the in New South Wales, the first DAP, the Hawkesbury Nepean DAP, also where we get to with the Northern Rivers and the other DAPs that are underway, because they are framed up in a way where they're seeking to guide and coordinate government interaction through the planning system, through all parts of the disaster planning life cycle, and also to look to unlock private sector and philanthropic investment as well. Because if we don't understand the scale of the problem and what government coordination and investment is needed, it's then very hard to strategically attract the right private sector investment that is going to help us address the scale of the problem that we're facing. So I think the way that has been shaped up, the DAP guidelines and the learnings that New South Wales government was really proactive in saying this is being embedded into the guidelines and how we move forward. I think we're really looking forward to working with the state at from a joint organisation of councils' perspectives, which is what's happening across the state, to see if that is a way to help us join up some of these housing planning, disaster management agencies, policies and the like, so that we can get more of a place-based view on where new housing goes. How do we make sure it's it's safe, and that's able to be, we can adapt to the climate change and the disasters that are coming to us, and how do we make sure that community voice is really strong throughout all parts of that process. So I think, and over to you, David.
I'm so sorry, Melinda. I didn't mean to interrupt you. Sorry, I was going to ask Tom if I could hop in on the back of that. Apologies.
Please. Yeah.
I think the DAPs are a massive step in the right direction as part of the SDMP, and I completely agree with you, Melinda. It's exciting about what can happen. And I can say this because I'm independent. The words are great, but the RA and others need to walk the talk. It's hard for agencies to give up power. And if this is a serious thing where community-centered recovery is in the center, that means sharing power. It means collaboration. It means more than words. And again, this is the systems, not the people. This is not. It's a choice about genuine collaboration to do those things, because things have changed so much. We have to adaptation. Tragically, we're having to adapt as opposed to prevent. We are a bit of adapt to prevent, but you know what I mean. It's upon us and it's happening. And happily, the DAP reflects this and the SDMP. But it does need to be monitored and measured in terms of, actually, does that council feel stronger? Is that council more in charge? Does that community feel like it's better heard? We presented a small amount of our survey for our final report. And again, you'll find this everywhere. The people are not heard sufficiently well in recovery, and certainly in preparedness and prevention. I don't care what survey, what country, which year and what decade. It is an absolute classic thing, the clash between the bottom up and the top down, and the disenfranchisement, frankly, of local governance. And so we all want this to work. I've never met anybody who doesn't. But you know what? It is a decision by those with power about whether they want to genuinely collaborate or do another form of governance, because there are lots of choices about how you do it. And let's hope it's the collaboration for genuine gain.
Yeah, and I think also the lessons learned as well, like when we look at the reports that came out of the Northern Rivers Living Lab and just the reflections from that, how are we taking that community experience really to the heart of what we do as governments to form up what that future collaboration and policy looks like, and ensuring that we really drive that investment to enable local government to play that leading role.
Yeah, there's no shortage of voices. You mentioned the Living Lab with Elizabeth Mossop and others, and Resilient Liz Moore with Ellie Bird, and of course Janelle Saffin, the MP, genuinely pushing for getting it right. And that's, there's a lot of cleverness around, and it's tapping into that in a way that's collaborative. And I'm really deliberately using that word as opposed to coordinating. That's one thing, and that's important. Collaboration is different to coordination. And if we're serious about localization, then that's the word.
That's right. And I think also looking structurally at those funding and investment pathways and how that funnels down, and the longevity of that funding is key, because, we can also see the comments coming through that are just spot on around, we don't have the resourcing, and there are significant threats to the financial sustainability of local government, who is, councils are really feeling enormous pressure in terms of the costs, even when we look at things like the repair of our roads. And where I live, just out of Sydney, our local council is just repairing the same roads over and over again. And this takes time and has significant impacts in terms of transport and access and so on. But the cost is just skyrocketing. So, and that's also been flagged in the Office of Local Government report recently, which is also really calling out that cost shifting we're seeing that's happening with local government.
Yeah, look, thanks both of you for those really fascinating observations around that, and nice of you to return to the first Melinda at the end of that as well. Look, I've been keeping half an eye on the chat here, and there's been some really interesting discussion taking place, and obviously some links and other things being sent through in relation to those New South Wales policies as well. So do have a look at that. Look, I'm going to turn now to consider some of the questions that we had come through in relation to this webinar. And look, a number of these have been touched on already in the conversation that we've had, but I just want to really, I guess, emphasise a couple of key issues that did come through very strongly in the questions that we received. The first one does get back to that point about resourcing. Local government, struggling to deliver everything they need to deliver, which is, an ever-expanding set of services well beyond roads and rubbish, and doing it with, increasingly constrained in a resource-constrained environment. The question or the questions that came through sort of within that area, we're talking about, I guess, how we move to a resilience focus, which is much more in the sort of upstream preventative space of operation than a disaster response situation where obviously, disasters happened, council, gets active and does what it needs to do, and often what it has a statutory obligation to do in terms of assisting with recovery. How do we actually, in really practical ways, start to shift that dial? And I was thinking it's quite similar. We've had a number of webinars looking at the issue of homelessness in Australia too. It's a similar kind of problem where the extent of the problem that manifests is so great that we're all caught up and all resources get to very focused on dealing with the emergency at hand. How do we divert some energy and resourcing to the preventative space, and how do we actually invest in building resilience? What are the actual things that that communities, governments, whoever needs to do to actually start to switch that around, to turn that ship around and have more investment or activity flowing into that preventative space? Obviously, in a situation where we're continuing to have to respond to emergency, and we obviously can't, reduce or cut anything out of that. So how do we do it?
And
David, you go first.
Well, one thing that's sorry to jump in like that. One thing that sticks out immediately is betterment. The idea that after a bridge collapses or something else, you replace like for like is clearly absurd. And I heard Amanda Leck talk publicly about this, a very senior person in the RA recently, that it's obviously nuts that you can't improve something as opposed to replacing something. So shifting that, and there are logical arguments about non-betterment, but it's also absurd at the same time. So betterment is a very clear one, that actually when something collapses, you improve it rather than replace it. And that's the same argument for roads, Melinda. And let's not beat ourselves up too much. We've actually done a lot. The whole existence of building codes is widely attributed to the fire of London, where it burned down. So let's stop that happening. And building codes are all about a repetition of disasters. That said, too many building codes and planning laws have become so utterly complicated. Getting anything done at all is nigh on impossible. And I'm pulling out Jago and Annette's work on that. Please read more if you want to. So there is a third practical one around simplification of planning process, which I think everybody would agree with totally. But that's around speed and prevention and all those things. So the systems, the alignments, the data, the blah. But betterment is a clean one. It's straight off.
Melinda, do you have any thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I agree with David, and I also think having shared understanding and information around hazards and the risks we're facing is also really key. If we don't have that, it's very hard to have a conversation that is solution focused if we're not all sitting clearly with what is the problem. And I think that's something that has not necessarily been shared. We've now lived through it over the past, particularly the last 5 years. And if we look at, even from an insurance perspective, just in 2022, we had over 302,000 disaster-related claims. and that resulted in insurance damages of 7.2 billion. Like, we have so much more data and insight now into what we're paying out, and that risk, seeing what happens at the other end. We now need to bring that back and have an agreed place to start in terms of this is where we're at with the hazards we face. And I think a good example around how this has been done well is through the process to form the Greater Sydney Heat Smart City Plan. So heat is a huge risk we are facing. It's been grappled with by cities across the globe. And that plan, which was launched in December, it's a 5-year plan. It has had incredible cross-agency, community, industry, business support in its formation. And that really started by understanding the risk of heat on lives, on health, on infrastructure, on citywide systems, on housing, infrastructure, and so on. And through that, we now have a very clear action plan and a Greater Sydney Heat Task Force that is jointly chaired by local government and also the New South Wales Reconstruction Authority. So whilst that's still in the first year of the 5 years of implementation, the process just to develop that has been really unique in terms of the expertise, and also looking to New South Wales Reconstruction Authority, who will be playing a convening role in New South Wales government and bringing all those agencies along. So often the levers are shared and distributed across many government departments and, of course, all 3 levels of government. So how do we bring that together in a way that we can set ourselves up to then look at, okay, this is what we now need to do, this is who does what, and this is how we're now going to need to seek the funding to implement. And the community voice has to be core throughout that whole process.
Melinda, you mentioned previously the importance of, I guess, not just government funding, but also philanthropic and private sector investment in the space as well. So I'm just wondering, and David, are there examples of that type of investment occurring in that resilience area, rather than in the response to disaster space, but in the disaster prevention space? Are we seeing philanthropic and private investment flow into that area?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I mean, it's always going to be much smaller, almost certainly, with some exceptions, than government funding, but there's still relevance. And I'm reminded, mentioning Melinda, the work with resilience, the Resilient Cities Initiative from the Rockefeller Foundation, which was global, and Sydney was as a recipient of one of 100 cities, and a friend to many of us, Beck Dawson, was the Chief Resilience Officer, and has been really pushing the heat agenda, as you would know, Melinda, so well, and also working with local government. So there's a lot on that. At the risk of making too much of a noise, our new initiative, howwesurvive.com, is philanthropically funded, and it's around reshaping disaster recovery. So people's voices are at the center. We're starting in Australia, a world map of people's voices of recovery, the good, the less good, the what could be better. And that's thanks to that kind of funding. We have very long-term funding going for the next 4 decades with that. So we can literally afford to build that over time in a way that you're unable to with electoral cycles. So I think philanthropic funding can provide that difference and is essential. But of course, inevitably, it's few and far between.
Yeah, that's actually quite a nice segue to the next question I was going to ask, which comes through from a couple of people in our audience, which was about that bringing in of voices, the voices of lived experience, people who have experienced disaster and live to tell the tale and have that experience of rebuilding and recovery. And also, I guess, the voices of long-time residents of locations who have that history of place and understand some of the background to disaster risk in that area. How do we better? Are we sufficiently enabling those voices to be heard, and are there better ways to do that?
Yes. Sorry to jump in, but no, we're not nearly listening well enough, and that's a global phenomenon. global research over 5 years, 5,000 people. The top phrase was "Listen to us better, please." In recovery, it's called the Time to Listen to report. Design with our ears is another phrase one could use, trotting these things out. That actually shut up and listen. Those mandated to recover, not relief, but recover, are not incentivized to spend time listening and engaging, because you have KPIs around efficiency and not effectiveness. And there's people are busy, and no time to listen. And that no time to listen trips us up when it comes to engagement. And people become victims as opposed to agents of their own recovery. And I could bang on for hours, but I won't, because you're doing this too, Melinda. But just on map, we're adding an AI functionality that you can interrogate our world map and ask the map about these kinds of things. But yeah, it's a systemic problem in recovery, prevention, preparedness, that we don't listen well enough.
Melinda, how's Resilient Sydney listening? What are the mechanisms that are being used to ensure that voices are heard, and not just heard, but actually enabled to play that bigger role?
Look, I think in the formation of our strategy, which we launched a couple of months ago, that community voice was structurally the core of that. So we know that people want to talk about the future of Sydney and what type of communities they want to live in, and how they want to, their ideas around how they want to lead and grow. So, and we did that through a very detailed consultation across Greater Sydney, which involved everything from workshops with specific targeted communities, but coupled also with a deliberative democracy process where people were selected to represent the diversity of the communities which we serve. So I think it's very important that those voices, obviously not just at the time of forming up a strategy or an idea, but making sure that the voice of our youth, our diverse communities, the leadership and the caring for country and the resilience that's been demonstrated by our First Nations communities are really foundational to all stages of what we deliver in how we coordinate, collaborate, and also empower communities to lead. So David's right, we need to do that more. We need to make sure that the ideas and the leadership is really invested in, because ultimately that's where we're going to have a legacy of real impact. And we also know, coming in at the point of the disaster in that initial recovery, we're stepping out way too quickly. There might be some upfront finance engagement, there's boots on the ground. That recovery timeline takes a very long time. So our communities also reflected, how are we learning from what has happened? How are we learning from what's come out of COVID? How are we learning from all the natural disasters we're continually experiencing, or climate-induced disasters we are experiencing? And again, the terrific work in the Northern Rivers on the reflections from the Living Lab. There's such richness there. How are we bringing that into our policy and our collaborations going forward? And that's a challenge and something we have to continually strive to do better.
Look, thank you. Thank you both. We're getting to the end of our time, actually, in the webinar. So I'm just going to quickly wrap up. And look, thank you very much, David, Melinda, for your really thoughtful contributions today, and the really interesting conversation that we've had. And I'd also like to thank all of you, our audience who've joined us today as well. And just, as I say, keeping an eye on the discussion in the side there. It's been really fascinating, and clearly there's a number of connections and interesting conversations that have been taking place. So it's great to see that as well. Look, I do want to ask you, please, to fill in the webinar feedback questionnaire that should be arriving in your email inbox as we speak. We really appreciate your feedback, and that helps us to continue to improve and refine the webinars that we do. And very quickly, just a reminder to AHURI runs a major conference every year, and coming up in October, which is quite soon, is the National Housing Conference, which this year is taking place in Perth. And the important details about that what can be seen on the screen there, but the website I draw your attention to in the corner is where you can register and also find out more. Look, thank you once again for joining us. Thank you so much, David. Thank you, Melinda. We really appreciated that, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon, everybody.